Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And hello, good morning. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. I hope you're enjoying the holidays and Merry Christmas Eve. I mean, this will air on Saturday morning, and hopefully you're snuggled up by a fire and friends and family, a toasty fire, and maybe a good book. But hope you're enjoying a little bit of a break because we're heading into the legislative session and it's going to be an interesting one. Today, I'm going to be talking with Charles Goodmacher, a consultant for New Mexico Voices for Children and other good causes and organizations. He is involved in developing and advocating for legislation to create a public health and climate change program within the health department. The program would be charged with evaluating the relationship between public health and climate change events, and then funding evidence-based practices designed to mitigate or prevent the harm done by climate-created catastrophes. The big topic, and we'll get to Charles in just a minute. First, a few brief announcements. Last week, I spoke with Rachel Feldman. She is the chair of the Civil Rights and Criminal Justice Reform Committee of Indivisible SOS Santa Fe. We spoke about the development of new criminal justice reform legislation that Rachel has been involved with. The legislation wouldn't just be a training program added on to a system, but rather a complete systemic overhaul of the criminal justice system with a training and monitoring and regulate and oversight component to ensure that those reforms are implemented with fidelity. I want to remind you that it was a very interesting interview. So I want to remind you that if you are listening to the show while driving around town and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior show, including the one with Rachel, by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the lower right side of the homepage. You'll find recordings of all our shows listed there in chronological order, so you can binge watch Retake on the Radio and cancel your Apple TV subscription. Yeah, that's our Christmas present to you. Before we get started, I also want to acknowledge that we are conducting the show at stolen Tela land, and I want to thank our Tela neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We have a good deal to learn from them. We better learn it fast. We're running out of time, folks. Okay, let's meet Charles. Welcome to the show, Charles.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so I like to let our guests introduce themselves. So please introduce yourself and tell our listeners how you became involved as a consultant with New Mexico Voices for Children and an advocacy for studying the public health impacts caused by catastrophic climate events.
Sure will. Thank you, Paul. So I am an advocate who currently works as a lobbyist. New Mexico Voices for Children is one of my core ongoing clients over the last several years. I first came to work with them. Actually, I came into contact with them years ago. I used to work with the NEA, the National Education Association, and you probably many of your listeners are familiar with the Annie E. Casey report on children's health and well-being that New Mexico Voices is the provider of that information to New Mexico. And so I've always admired their work, and having lobbied at the legislature for the NEA, saw them in action on so many important issues to protect.
They're rock stars.
Sorry?
I said they're rock stars.
They are absolutely rock stars. A group of a good core of analysts and also just smart political strategists for bringing the analysis into the real world, so to speak, of politics. And so I've been a supporter of theirs. And then when the opportunity came to work with them, to help them in consulting and lobbying capacity, I absolutely jumped on board. So I also incidentally came to work on, I mentioned having worked in education, and here I am working on health and climate issues. Well, it really wasn't too far of a jump for me, because the education world, we constantly were hearing, oh, there's not enough money for education this year. We have to be quote unquote prudent. And then all of a sudden there would be, the roller coaster of oil and gas. So there'd be lots of money. And then the answer was, oh no, we have to save for the downturns. So the reliance of New Mexico State for funding education, for funding healthcare, for funding all sorts of important social services that lift up our families is inextricably tied to our over-reliance on the oil and gas industry for revenues. And that industry wields an enormous political power at the legislature. So I along with others, and Voices obviously is among the chief, see the connection between our overdependence on oil and gas and our insufficient support for education and healthcare and other needs of our people.
Yeah, we were talking before we started recording the show about how in the last few weeks, I've been doing radio shows with different guests who work on issues related to legislation they're proposing. And in every single interview, they mention some state department with which they work, whether it's environment and minerals and natural resources, education, or the health department. And every one of them said they just don't have even a fraction of what they need in terms of resources to do their job. And here we are with like multi-billion-dollar surplus this year. And people are talking about a flat budget and like they can't think of anything to do with that money. And it's like shameful. Anyway, we're off topic. Let's get back on topic. What are the current public health issues and problems in New Mexico that you hope to address with this legislation? And how is our health failing to address health conditions caused by climate?
That's a great question. A lot of people aren't aware that the climate changes that we're already experiencing in New Mexico are having long-term impacts on public health. People are certainly aware of the impact of the smoke from the fires from last summer. And we can't forget the smoke from previous years that also we breathe, that from fires in Arizona and other places in the country that, smoke doesn't stop at the state line. But what folks are not all that aware of is that actually New Mexico's ambient air temperature is increasing at the fastest rate of all 50 states in our country. It's already increased by 2 degrees over the previous normal. And so we're also seeing impacts even on there were more mosquitoes as far north as Albuquerque this year. That's climate change related. Mm-hmm. And so actually the bill that we're going to talk more details about later, it is broad enough that it's about health impacts of all climate changes. So it's not necessarily just extreme weather events like fires and smoke or freezes and heat waves. Okay. Ongoing issues.
So are you doing the research and advocacy on this issue on behalf of New Mexico Voices for Children? And if so, can you share why they see this as a children's issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I am working primarily on behalf of New Mexico Voices for Children. That being said, I need to acknowledge that right now there's 15 other groups that are on board with supporting this, including the Pediatrics Association, Presbyterian signed on just the other day. One of their departments, I don't want to misname which the corporate entity it is, but Pediatrics, like I said, Public Health Association, but also a slew of climate-focused organizations as well are behind it. So now I've forgotten the original question that I was. It was about Voices and.
Are you doing this on behalf of Voices?
Oh yeah.
Why is it? Do they see this as a children's issue?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I am doing it primarily on behalf of Voices, and absolutely, it's a children's issue. Among the increased health impacts that we're having is actually, as it's hotter, children are much more affected by changes in heat and variations. They also breathe much faster, drink more water relative to the body weight, et cetera, and need more water. And so they are highly impacted by changes in temperature, extreme temperatures, and so on. But also study after study is showing that knowledge of climate change is a huge behavioral impact on America's youth. A lot of young people are very aware of the dire situation that the world is in, and there's looking, old folks like us, we're worried about the future because we have time left, of course, but also in the future beyond that, our children, our grandchildren. Young kids are growing up right now. They're seeing a world that is greatly endangered, and that affects their behavioral health
So could
as
this
well.
legislation also address behavioral health concerns on the part of our behavioral health reactions to climate?
Well, it could. Let me back up a second to talk a little bit about one part of the bill, because it allows for local jurisdictions to apply to the Department of Health to receive some funding to do planning for preventative measures to protect the public health of our people in their local area. So that could include, if their assessment of the health data and then the weather and climate information shows we're going to have a problem in this arena. If they identify that and they put that in the grant to the Department of Health, I believe that would likely be funded, some behavioral health measures.
So it's incumbent upon local jurisdictions to do the groundwork of the assessment and request for funding. Is there any funding for them to do that work?
Yeah, well, that's the other part of the bill, is actually not direct funding to give them money to do the planning in this sense, or sorry, let me back up. The first part of the bill would create some positions in the Department of Health. A large part of their work would be to help local jurisdictions put that information together and to review possible responses to it.
Okay. As part of your work, did you and the team that developed this legislation reflect on evidence-based practice from other states and maybe in other nations as to how to address primary care and behavioral health care concerns caused by climate?
Yes, we've been looking into that very thoroughly, and we're very fortunate to have in our state a young man who is actually doing this work for Washington State. He's a young person who grew up in New Mexico, is now working remotely for Washington State from Albuquerque. So expertise in climate health emergencies. And so he shared with us a lot of data and is helping us get more data on what states like Washington and Oregon are doing. You may recall about 2 summers ago, there was very intense heat wave in the Northwest, literally killed hundreds of people in both Oregon and Washington State, also in British Columbia. So those states responded with a program very much like what we're proposing for New Mexico, which is, they started doing proactive planning in advance of the next weather events and figuring out what are they going to need to do. So very few people passed last year as a consequence of that work. And we hope to have similarly dramatic impacts here in New Mexico.
Yeah. I noticed that the legislation in its current form would result in, assessing and addressing the impact of climate change, both in the sense of, dramatic events, but also, as you were saying, more sustained, just the context of, being in a desert and dry and hot and all of that. But will it also address public health consequences from the extractive industry itself and the mining industry in terms of spills and methane leaks and things like that, or living in proximity of fracking operations?
Yeah, well, it could. Again, it comes back to what local jurisdictions identify as their issues affecting the public health in their area from climate change related activities. So if they were to identify that, they could put that in their grant request, and it would be up to the Department of Health to fund it. I believe that they made their case that, I can't speak for the Department of Health, of course, but it seems that would fit.
Does the bill include criteria by which for to guide the health department's decision making on what is a valid request for intervention or support?
It does include some criteria. Like I mentioned, they have to speak to the data, so that both the health data that they have on the people in their county, and then the data in the state of New Mexico, by the way, in its various agencies, does have enormous data on what the predictions are for climate within subregions of our state. That was initially developed for water concerns, because some parts of the state are going to dry quicker than others and so on. So, and that needs to be understood. So that's a possibility.
Okay. So I need to take a kind of short break here, Charles, to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever during these times of misinformation and on both the mainstream media and in social media. And at KSFR, you get great news, you get the BBC, you get Democracy Now!, you get the local news, and you get all kinds of cultural programming and interview programs like this. And at 8 a.m. every morning, I always encourage our listeners, not every morning, every Saturday morning, I encourage our listeners to listen to Economic Update with Richard Wolff before you listen to this show. It is a remarkable show. Richard Wolff is one of the smartest people in America, and he has completely nailed it in his analysis that capitalism is at the root of all of our problems, virtually all of them. And he each week takes on a different aspect of that. And by the time you've listened for a few weeks, you'll get it if you don't already. And if you do get it, then you'll have it affirmed. And besides, what a great way to start your Saturday morning, a cup of coffee and 1 hour of solid progressive radio. So tune in at 8 and stick around at 8:30 for us. And we'll get back to Charles Goodmacher right now. He's the consultant for New Mexico Voices for Children and an advocate for having the state examine public health impacts generated by climate change triggered by catastrophic events or climate conditions just generally. So we're back with Charles. Okay, let's shift from what the bill isn't going to necessarily directly cover the extractive industry, but let's take the recent Hermit's Peak fire in northeast New Mexico. What health impacts are likely as a result of that fire?
Oh, well, respiratory, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But respiratory problems, which, people could have had some chronic low-level respiratory problems that were accelerated, raised up to a higher level because of the amount of smoke that they had their intake. But also, when you find a respiratory, you're also affecting the heart conditions are impacted. And with the long-term consequences can be very severe in both of those arenas, heart and lung, as well as, again, the impact on people's mental health outlook. We talked earlier about children and projecting forward a grim future. People lose their homes, people who lose their ways of life, and it has enormous impact on your feeling, your state of well-being.
Those are multi-generational communities.
Yes.
A lot of land grant people who don't have any real wealth beyond their land. And a cultural tie to that community. So it's more than just like, oh, well, we'll rebuild our home. It's our community has been destroyed.
Yeah. And it's also not like people who've lived there for generations. You don't want to move to Oshkosh or someplace else.
Right.
This is where you are. So that the mental health outlook can have an enormous impact on our physical well-being, as we all know.
So if this legislation had been in place a couple of years ago, what might the health department have done to study these fire-generated impacts? And what strategies could it have implemented to help mitigate or prevent some of the conditions we're anticipating from the Hermit's Peak fire?
Oh, that's a great question, Paul. They could have there's a lot of things. I'm sure some things I can't even think of. But what comes to mind is um, if they had done the data, the research on where their people are located, their conditions, knowing, um, that there's an 82-year-old person or 80-something-year-old couple that has a bunch of animals and they don't want to leave their home unless like it's actually burning. uh, they could have helped pre-plan to place, well, first of all, just mapping them and being aware so that if there's an emergency happening, someone can go to them right at the moment. That helps in itself. But also, they could have pre-planned to have placed uh, air filters, reasonably inexpensive air filters in their home and worked with them to help maybe seal, so they're more airtight in terms of resistance to smoke. Um, the county could have also identified that as a need to clear more brush around their house. So they're also, a county or other jurisdiction could also even ask for more air quality monitors, to purchase through the grants so they could have a better tracking of what's happening with the air. That could have been helpful to vacate, either evacuate people quicker and so on, and take other actions.
Is the air quality, I mean, it's not like the fire goes out and the air quality just returns to normal
Right.
instantly. For how long is the air quality impacted?
Um, that I think that's variable depending on the weather, the winds, and those kind of factors. If it rains right away, that clears the air. So, yeah, it's completely variable in the weather.
So looking into the future, let's assume a future extreme heat event extends for weeks. How could this legislation help New Mexico prepare for this inevitability? Because it's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah. Well, coming along with extreme heat, you might have it might actually dry up some local water sources as well. So, the pre-planning that could happen could include pre-planning to have cooling centers in various locations, nearest where people are, uh, and what a cooling center would need to keep people protected inside of it. Do they need to upgrade the ventilation in that building, whatever the building is otherwise used for, and so on. Placing of water and other supplies in advance. Those are all possible things that a local jurisdiction could use the grant application to do.
Okay. All right. Well, we certainly are going to have these things coming, so it's important that we're ready. What other possible events could also be on the agenda for study and mitigation and planning?
Well, especially with how cold it is right now, I'm reminded of the possibility of real deep freeze could hit New Mexico too. And while we haven't had extreme deep freezes in recent history, it wasn't too long ago that in the north, in Espanola area and further north, a lot of folks like the gas lines, broke. The service was discontinued and so on. So a lot of people suffered from experiencing extreme cold, and those kind of incidents are likely to happen again at some point. But remember in Florida, the recent hurricanes, the tidal waves or the tidal surge.
Right. Yes.
How in the past they had never experienced tidal surges above 6 or 7 feet.
Right.
So they did their planning based on past experience, but the tidal surges went up to 16 or 17 feet, more than doubling what had previously been known. So unless we think that New Mexico is somehow completely special in terms of the whole world, of avoiding anything that is beyond what we've experienced in the past, we have to anticipate that the extreme weather events we have in the future are going to be more extreme than we've ever anticipated.
And more frequent.
Yes, and more frequent. They're going to be fiercer and more frequent. So we really have to be prepared.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I do want to ask who's sponsoring the legislation and do you have broad community and legislative support?
Great questions. Yes, Senator Liz Stefanik, chair of the Consent and Conservation Committee, with great background in health, is the Senate sponsor. Representative Liz Thompson, chair of the House Health Committee,
Another
is the
yay.
House
You
sponsor.
got two of the better legislators leading this charge. That's good.
I think so. Thank you.
And from what you have reasonably good legislative support and support from the governor.
We know that we have reasonably good legislative support. We're just starting now that we finished off the draft. We're going to start getting co-sponsored. By the way, Rena Sapansky in Santa Fe, new House Whip, she volunteered that she would be a co-sponsor. And I know that Senate President Pro Tem Stewart is also on board with supporting it. So I think we're going to have good possibilities in the legislature. Governor's office, we met with them. We have yet to hear back from them formally. I'm very positive about their response as well.
Do you think, can you tell people where they can get more information on this legislation?
Yes. One of the organizations supporting this that New Mexico Voices is the host of is a network called the New Mexico Environmental Public Health Network. Their website is NM, like for New Mexico, NMEPHN, environmentalpublichealthnetwork.org. And on that site, people can get more information about this and also link to suggestions for contacting legislators or the governor's office to support it.
And we will be supporting the legislation as well. So listeners, look for us to have something about this soon.
Great. We'll add you to the list.
Okay. I want to thank Charles Goodmacher for spending so much time with us today. It's a very interesting discussion on a very important topic. I'm sure our audience has heard enough to want to learn more. And the Retake website is the best place to go for info on the bills like this one that we will be supporting in 2023. Go to retakeourdemocracy.org, click on legislation in the banner, and you'll enter a portal to information on bills, what they would do, and how you can get involved. We'll be back next week with another interview. We don't jump onto KSFR, but don't jump onto KSFR at 8:30. Tune in at 8 and listen in to Richard Wolf with Economic Update. Next week, we'll be talking to you on New Year's Eve day. So stick with it. And until next Saturday, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. Happy holidays and so long.
Thank you, Paul. Happy holidays.